And now I'm very happy to introduce you our next keynote speaker from Passau too. You would say some word, Karin Stögner. And we know each other from Rome, from 2 conferences. I met her there and I was so excited about her talk that I asked her the last time, please come to Frankfurt to join the Marcuse conference and be our keynote speaker on feminism. Unfortunately, two panel speakers quitted, canceled the talk. So I don't know how you handle it, but I think we will. So everybody is invited to hear her talk, and I'm very proud that she's here. Thank you, Karin, and it's your stage.
Thank you very much, Peter Erwin, for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I really enjoyed the talks this morning, and I'm pretty sure that I will come back to at least 2 of them, who were quite topical. I'm talking about a rather broad topic, feminism and critical theory. It will be hard to address this broad topic within 25 minutes. So I decided to concentrate on a talk that Herbert Marcuse gave almost 50 years ago. In 1974, the talk was entitled Marxism and Feminism. And many of you will be familiar with this talk. And in this talk, he outlined his thoughts on the importance of the women's movement and of feminism for a revolutionary change of society. So in my talk, I will first reconstruct Marcuse's conceptualization of the specific feminine and female qualities that he outlined in this talk as a hope for a future free society. And in doing so, I will show the theoretical and practical pitfalls of this line of argument. And in the second step, I will refer to the dialectic of integration and emancipation that is also addressed by Marcuse in this talk. And I will finish with some remarks on the obstruction of change and also some remarks on today's potential of a feminist negation. Where can we find feminist negation today? So let me start with my first point, the reconstruction of Marcuse's argument. Marcuse actually discussed his ideas broadly with feminists and activists of women's movement, and we've got a lot of protocols of these discussions, and they are really rich documents about the discussions, what was going on, about the criticism also from the part of feminists toward Marcuse. And I think that his key argument in this lecture can be summarized as follows. In the patriarchal civilization, women have been subjected to a specific kind of repression, which has also formed their mental and physical development in a certain direction. Under these conditions, they have developed so-called, let me quote, feminine qualities, receptivity, sensitivity, nonviolence, tenderness, and so on, end of quote. These feminine or female qualities signify a different non-repressive reality principle since they are antithetical to the capitalist mode of production. So the feminine qualities mean something qualitatively different to the performance principle. And the performance principle is characterized by Marcuse as follows, I quote, the rule of functional rationality, discriminating against emotions, a dual morality, the work ethic, which means for the vast majority of the population, condemnation to alienated and inhuman work, and the will to power, the display of strength and virility, end of quote. Marcuse leaves no doubt that these feminine qualities opposing to the performance principle are not directly biological facts, but second nature, meaning they are the historical product of gender domination. In view of this fact, he nevertheless sees in these images of femininity a promesse de bonheur, Even if they are images created by men, they dialectically turn against the performance principle. In a discussion with Sylvia Bovenschen and Marianne Schuller in 1974, he cites Delacroix, Flaubert, and Shakespeare, whose female figures bear a potential for resistance that would be fruitful for the emancipation not only of women, but of the society as a whole. And at this very point, Bovenschen and Schuller object that these positive determinations of the feminine reproduce the separation of reason and sensuality, that the feminine qualities exist only as male projective designs, and that there is a glaring contrast between the wealth of symbolic representations of femininity on the one hand, and the poverty of women's own history on the other hand. And the lack of confrontation between the image of femininity and the reality of women, this lack leaves Marcuse open to the accusation that he takes the appearance of male projections onto women at face value, and that he ignores what patriarchal domination actually means for women. So even if Marcuse does not make direct biologistic characterizations, an essentialization of women takes place. He links them to supposed characteristics that are due to particular historical situation and class position. And he turns them into women as a group, into carriers of hope for a liberated society. So the fundamental problem with this line of argument and the reason for the discomfort by many feminists is the unmediated identification of subject and attribution of women and so-called female characteristics. More mediation would be needed here, avoiding the direct personification of ideals and qualities. Furthermore, the question remains as to how the gap between such moments as receptivity, sensitivity, emotionality, and so on, can be mediated with reason, subjectivity, and autonomy. For this is precisely what is needed in order to transcend the performance principle, which is essentially based on instrumental reason and the exclusion of all that is dependent, intersubjective, and receptive. So the dominant understanding of subject and reason represents both as disembodied and as antithetical to emotions. And the related dominant understanding of autonomy implies abstract independence and hence the loneliness of the subject. These concepts of subjectivity and reason were met by fundamental feminist criticism, for example, by Iris Young, Jessica Benjamin, Sheila Ben-Habib, or Maeve Cook. And in the tradition of this feminist criticism, we can say that we need not refrain from autonomy altogether, but that we need a different concept of it, a different idea of it. Autonomy in a feminist sense can only be achieved through reciprocity of subjects, through living intersubjectivity. And conversely, sensitivity and receptivity need to be linked to conscious and reflective subject status, which feminist critique must first of all reveal. And here, I think, we can take as a starting point the qualities that Marcuse associates with femininity. And these qualities, as we know, arise through the exclusion from the process of bourgeois subjectification. For women have been excluded from the very form of subjectivity characterized by surplus repression and thus by loneliness and isolation. In this respect, the potential of a completely different form of subjectivity negatively appears in the gap of female subjectivation. The feminist form of subjectivity does not deny the conditio humana of interdependence, but makes it the starting point of reflected autonomy. This argument is well known in feminist criticism, it was already prepared in the authoritarian personality, the studies in the authoritarian personality, notably by Else Frankel-Brunswick. She analyzed the important role of gender relations and sexuality in authoritarianism, that in patriarchal capitalist context, autonomy is conceived only as abstract independence, completely detached from intersubjectivity. This is linked to social gender relations with a corresponding gendered division of labor. This is a fundamental insight, a radical insight of the Else Frankel-Brunswick. The conventional notion of autonomy is the flip side of the equally conventional notion of sensitivity and reciprocity. One has masculine connotations, the other has feminine connotation. Else Frankel-Brunswick analyzed this binary closely, and she found out that the more directly the two poles are opposed in the individual's drives and desires, the more pronounced are the authoritarian tendencies in the individual. This applies both to men and women. Ideal masculinity and ideal femininity, characteristic for the authoritarian personality, consists primarily in denying and repressing those features of one's own identity that conventionally belong to the other gender. So it's a strict division, a strict binarity. This is really one major characteristic of the authoritarian personality. And by contrast, the personality of the non-authoritarian men is characterized by a maternal orientation and an image of the father as mild and relaxed. Non-authoritarian men show a caring attitude dependent on love, which allows a degree of passivity and receptivity to be included in the ideal of masculinity. A related idea of autonomy thus not excludes the dependence on others, but grows in interpersonal relationships in which one is allowed to show weakness without provoking strength, as a famous quote by Adorno goes. Thus, in Frankel-Brunswick's account, characteristics like emotionality, sensitivity, and reciprocity in men, much more than in women, showed a tendency opposite to the authoritarian personality and authoritarianism. So unlike Marcuse, Frankel-Brunswick does not associate these qualities with women to derive from them a moment that contradicts the prevailing performance principle. But she begins with men who are not bound to authority. On the other hand, she traces how the authoritarian character transforms receptivity and sensuality into something weak and therefore feminine. For Frankel-Brunswick, these qualities are not feminine as such. Consequently, she does not place her hope for revolutionary change in women per se, but in people who are not bound by authority, both men and women. And I think that in this way, Frankel-Brunswick is much closer to an assessment of the real possibilities of social change than Marcuse, whose identification of feminine characteristics with women is not based on empirical evidence, but is derived from patriarchal images of femininity. But this is not to deny the liberating potentials of these very images. It is precisely the condemnation of receptivity, emotionality, and sensitivity as feminine and weak by the authoritarian men that negatively reveals the liberating potential within these images. Because authoritarian men too suspect that there is something in these qualities that transcends the repressive reality principle, to which they themselves must constantly and unhappily adapt. But instead of recognizing their own longing for a reality principle other than the dominant performance principle, they turn the sign of freedom into a sign of weakness and a sign of domination, and reject it by projecting it onto women. The same projection mechanism is central to anti-Semitism, as we heard this morning in the presentations, in anti-Semitism, in which the projections show a similar ambivalence towards the content of the projection. So that which is repelled must first of all be humiliated in order to repress the own desires of those who project in this way. This nexus of repressed needs points directly to the problem of how revolutionary change shall be implemented, because according to Marcuse, the material, technological, and intellectual forces for the new society are given, but the problem lies in how to transform the old society into the new, because this transformation actually requires conscious action. I will get back to this problem later, but let me first come to my second point, the dialectic of integration and emancipation, which is also central in Marcuse's lecture on Marxism and feminism. The women's movement explicitly demands full equality as a precondition of emancipation. Marcuse also supports this demand, but in doing so, he names the dilemma that women lose their distance to the existing performance principle through full integration as equal citizens, and that in the process of assimilation, the much vaunted feminine qualities that were previously second nature to them are increasingly cancelled out. Gudrun Axeli-Knapp later also described women's adaptation to the system of capitalist exploitation as a, I quote, successful failure of feminist critique, end of quote. So to say, an unintended side effect of the feminist struggle for recognition and equality. And similarly, Nancy Fraser also emphasized the mobilization that the mobilization of women's labor power and the concomitant push for women's subjectivation not only led to an enormous gain in women's equality within the system, but at the same time, to a certain extent, obstructed the vision of emancipation beyond the system. So this is the dilemma that Marcuse is talking about. And this dilemma of women's emancipation for him is not so much that women are integrated in a very contradictory form into the social totality, but that they might abandon supposedly feminine qualities in the course of social integration. Contrary to this, Regina Becker-Schmidt has convincingly argued that women's situation in late capitalism is determined by a simultaneity of qualitatively unequal demands, those of production and those of reproduction. And these two sides are quite contradictory. So for women's rights activists and feminists, the integration of women into the sphere of production was problematic not so much because it could lead to the leveling of so-called feminine qualities, but because two modes of domination directly interpenetrate women's lives, the patriarchal one and the capitalist one. And the contradictory integration of women into the performance principle also manifests on another level. The genuinely female areas of reproduction are increasingly outsourced to other, mostly migrant women, as usually low-paid care work. So at this point, it becomes clear that a society with full gender parity can still be capitalist and based on exploitation. And this is why we need feminism to be class critical. It can still be based on the discrimination of formerly colonized peoples and of marginalized ethnic minorities, which is why we need a feminism that is critical of racism. Full gender equality can still support heteronormativity, and that's why we need queer feminism. And gender equality does not necessarily mean that the social contradiction is recognized as social contradiction instead of being personalized, for example, in anti-Semitism. And this is why we need feminism critical of ideology. This constellation of different feminisms, when I'm talking about the importance of intersectional feminism. But what a fully gender equal society cannot be is patriarchal. It can no longer be organized according to traditions of gender apartheid. Following Marcuse, the goals of the women's movement, I quote, require changes of such enormity in the material as well as intellectual culture that there can be attained only by a change in the entire social system, end of quote. For him, I quote again, the women's movement aims at the freedom of women to determine their own life, not as wife, not as mother, not as mistress, not as girlfriend, but as an individual human being, end of quote. That this fundamentally challenges not only the gender order, but the entire social order is well known to all reactionaries of all stripes. This is evidenced by the culturalist, religious, fundamentalist, traditionalist rebellion against gender equality everywhere, on the part of right-wing radicals, as well as Islamists and Christian fundamentalists. In an extreme form of gender apartheid in Iran and Afghanistan, in tribalist traditions in Africa, in yet a different form in Russia or China, but also in the USA and in Europe, where we see that liberties once won are constantly in danger of being dismantled. Thus, with Marcuse, we can conceive of freedom only as a constant process of liberation from concrete relations of domination and as emancipation from all forms of patriarchal oppression. And each of these forms produce and require specific practices of resistance and subversion. So it is about transforming a rigid, blocked, and asymmetrical relationship of domination into mobile and reciprocal power relations. And within these power relations, power struggles are fought out and take place. And of course, these power struggles can lead back to fixed domination again. And this is why freedom and emancipation are always precarious and in danger of being reversed. And with this, I come to my third and last point, the obstruction of change and the potential of feminist negation today. The rejection of freedom is virulent, not only on the part of male domination, but also on the part of women who conform to the system and benefit from it, albeit mostly in a very mediated manner. An explanation for the fact that women so often opt for patriarchal domination, despite their unifying objective interest in emancipation, an explanation for this requires an analytical turn to the subject, because the relations, the social relations alone, don't tell us why the subjects act the way they do. And still, the subjects of domination are thoroughly socially mediated, as we learned also from Marcuse. Moreover, they have made the repressive society their own through introjection. Through these psychological mechanisms, the individuals themselves reproduce the repressive society in their very neat structures. In The End of Utopia, Marcuse says the following, I quote, "The break with the continuity of needs that already carry repression within them, the leap into qualitative difference is not something imagined, but something inherent in the development of the productive forces themselves," end of quote. So, but I think the problematic thing is that exactly these problematic forces include not only technology and technical skills, they include not only mental and intellectual capacities, but also the entire moral and cultural sphere. So that both the possibility of the leap into qualitative difference and the persistence in the realm of unfreedom actually spring from the same sources. The cultural and moral sphere, that of customs, traditions, and religions, which throughout history have been detrimental to the equality of women and the liberation of sexuality, this cultural and religious sphere has in recent decades grown in importance almost proportionally to the technological possibilities of eliminating inequality and misery. This raises the question for me of whether the great refusal and the rejection of consumer culture has led less to emancipation than to a one-sided rejection of the West per se, and to a return of culture, identity, tradition, and religion as supposedly authentic needs. With Marcuse, we can read such backwardness as part of the, I quote, total mobilization of existing society against its own possibilities, end of quote. So to say, as a ruse of domination for its own preservation. Today, more than ever, domination is based on the false need for a mendacious suppression of sexuality and drives, the negation of which with Marcuse remains the driving force behind the leap into qualitative difference. And this negation, in turn, is linked to the development of consciousness, which, again with Marcuse, I quote, is indeed one of the main tasks of revolutionary materialism, end of quote. So, and with this I come to my end. The perspective must turn to the real struggles of women against oppression and patriarchy today. And even if women as such are not a collective subject, many achieve a privileged position of knowledge because of their position in the patriarchal structure of domination and because of their striving for freedom. And this privileged position of knowledge may manifest itself in a feminist negation of inequality. For women under totalitarian male rule, emancipation is an immediate physical urgency, with Marcuse a vital, necessary need, since they are directly threatened by death. The slogan of today's feminist protests in Iran, as well as that of the Kurdish fighters against ISIS, woman, life, freedom, testifies to this immediate physical urgency and gives an impression of power as a transforming force from below, as well as an idea of receptivity turned into aggressiveness against domination. In Iran today, as in many other places, the power of feminist negation and the quest for full emancipation is to be found. And this negation, however, consists less in ostensibly feminine qualities such as receptivity and sensitivity than much more in a determined refusal to endure the male disposition over one's own body and the exclusion from public, forced veiling, and the denial of autonomy and sexual self-determination. With this, I'm at my end. Thank you very much for your patience and for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karin. And you take questions, and we have still time for 5 minutes, maybe 2 or 3 questions. Feel free. Who has a question on Karin?
Very good. Thank you for the talk. Very thought-provoking and very, I think, on point. So, one question is, I've seen, in more recent times, queer theorists going back to Erussian civilization as a source of inspiration, where Marcuse has this argument about progressive regression, right? Somehow recovering the polymorphous perversity that lies in the body pre-socialization, not in a kind of romantic way, but in a sort of, he argues, we have to go through socialization, and at a later stage, a higher stage, we could recover, a kind of, non-binary, because you've stressed the argument in Marxism and feminism rests upon a problematic binary, but there is this other strand in his thinking which has been quite, maybe not, but I've seen a number of people who've gone back to Marcuse for these reasons, and I'm just wondering if that's something that you have considered as well. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, John. I thought about this androgynous society, a utopia of androgynous society, and we discussed this already in the morning a little bit. Because there is the potential of something beyond the gender principle. And I think it's also in Marcuse an idea of beyond the gender principle. But for him, it's not conceivable that there would be something else than two genders. And this may sound to our ears today in 2023, this may sound weird. Because if there's still a binary, and if you can't think beyond the binary, if you must stick to female and male, to men and women, then how can there be a beyond of the gender principle? And I think there can, because gender then, in a situation of freedom, would mean something different, would not be a principle anymore. And if gender is not a principle anymore, it loses much of the brutal notion that it's got today in so many areas. So I think that the utopia of, or maybe Marcuse wouldn't even have called it utopia because it's possible already. So it's actually within our reach. The androgynous society is not a queer society. He didn't have the concept of queerness yet. So this is 50 years ago. But I think he had an idea of it. And today maybe he would call it queer. And today he would probably say it's not necessary to stick to the binary between male and female in order to or that is hindering, actually, that this binary is actually hindering the liberation of eros. So yes, I think there is still a contradiction within Marcuse, but with my colleague from today in the morning, I would say that there is so much in it that we can kind of grasp and further develop. I mean, it's not necessary to stick to Marcuse the very word by word as he wrote it, but it's important for us to rescue those ideas and to include them into our.
What I'm thinking about here is, it seems to me, as soon as you mentioned Marcuse on feminine qualities, I thought, well, what would Simone de Beauvoir have to say about this? Now, given that she had published her work long before Marcuse published this essay, her book came out right after the end of the war, right? Originally in a journal and then in book form in, I think it was 49, and that he doubtless was familiar with it. I'm wondering, on a factual level, is there such a thing as a response by Simone de Beauvoir to Herbert Marcuse? But if there's not, since I don't actually know of one, perhaps we should have a theoretical debate, so to speak, about what ought Marcuse have said to her and what would she have responded to him.
Yes, thanks, Jack. I would not know of any discussion between Beauvoir and Marcuse, but I know that discussion between Sylvia Bovenschen and Marcuse, to which I referred in my talk. And I think this very conversation can stand like a proxy for the discussion which we don't have between Beauvoir and Marcuse. And you should, it's really worthwhile reading the protocol of that discussion. It's in a small Surkamp volume, Gespräche mit Marcuse, edited by Sylvia Bovenschen and Jürgen Habermas, for those who don't know. And in this discussion, it's really funny because Marcuse was so almost, well, he was upset. He was really upset by the feminist criticism that, and he didn't understand it at all. He said, why are you attacking me? I am the one who is appreciating feminine qualities. I'm not the one who's saying that's bad and we need to get rid of it and it needs to be, I don't know what, it needs to be, well, yeah, it needs to be generalized, but still, why are you so furious with me seeing positive things? So he simply did not understand that these so-called feminine qualities not only come out of domination, but that they also reproduce domination, gender domination. He thought they come out of gender domination, no doubt about that. It's not first nature, it's second nature. But that this very second nature is not only a sign of liberation, but in the first place, it reproduces the very status of women as weak and as not autonomous. This he did not actually come to terms with fully. And I think that, well, I can guess that Simone de Beauvoir probably would have had the same objections to Marcuse as Sylvia Bovenschen had.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Super der Applaus for Karin Stögner.